Thank you. I'd like to ask first, before we take questions, is there anyone who can answer the question about whether the educational attainment, there was any validation work done? Anyone on the phone or from NCES who's here? Yeah? Steve?
You want me to comment on that?
Stephen Provaznik?
Hi, yes. I'm Stephen Provaznik from the National Center for Education Statistics, and have worked with Jaleh since the very beginning of PIAAC, and Eugene Owen, who sadly isn't here today. So I'm going to speak up to provide a response to Dr. Liu in regard to the question that you kind of posed, having to do with the search, because you're right. Currently, in the PSTRE, there's actually no search mechanism for an online search. And that began with such items. However, the reason they had to be dropped had specifically to do with comparability across all the different languages that were used, and specifically because of the Japanese restrictions on the way that search engines work in Japanese. There are so many homonyms when you have the kanji characters, and it presented insurmountable difficulties, and we had to drop, sadly, those because we had worked so hard to develop those items. And so in return, all that is in it, all that we ended up being able to put in are preset results for a search as if it was done for you, and then to evaluate what was found. But you're absolutely right, and we were very aware of that and very sad when we had to actually drop those items.
There was another question also about validating the responses on their level of education.
So I'm happy to talk about the educational attainment item in particular, which is an item that has been used for a long, long time on federal surveys. And all I can say is you don't really want to look at how the sausage is made very deeply. There are a lot of issues with that educational attainment item, and even people at the Census Bureau who work in that field in the demographic area will say that we understand that people who, have like an associate's degree or an educational certificate sometimes put themselves in high school, sometimes in some college, sometimes even at the associate's degree level if they have a certificate. So they haven't been validated in terms of this study for sure, in terms of knowing whether somebody who answered high school on the survey actually has a high school credential. But this is the standard item. It's the best we've got right now. It does need to be evaluated and reevaluated and improved. And hopefully that's something that the federal statistical system will address in the future.
Thank you. All right. Any questions about any of the papers or the discussants' comments?
Hi, I'm David Rosen, and I actually have a question for Steve, my colleague. Steve, you made an important distinction between ICT skills and digital literacy skills. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, particularly since the findings were so different for different categories of people in some ICT skills versus digital literacy skills.
Is this hot? It is. Thanks for that question, David. Well, when I was talking about digital literacy, I was talking about the sort of final, in many ways, biggest stage of the developmental model, and I was saying that where someone was in the digital literacy space could be measured in a number of different ways. Problem solving being one of the ways I looked at in PIAAC, ICT use, both at home and in the workplace, being other ways to look at it. So I wasn't really comparing digital literacy with ICT use. I was using digital literacy as a sort of an umbrella or a container for a number of measures that are interrelated but distinct.
Hi, I'm Mike Tintel from the Council of Ministers of Education in Canada, and I have a question about the third paper, addressed to the third paper. If any of the author would like to comment on the Readiness to Learn Index that you used. I was wondering how you define, I noticed the low readiness to learn and high readiness to learn, and how how you decided on the distinction and whether you looked at the index as a continuous variable or not. Thank you.
Yeah, for the readiness to learn index, when we did the analysis, we used it as a continuous variable. The plots that I showed up there, it was artificially discretized just for the purposes of display purposes, and that was just looking at the mean score for doing a median split of the two. So the mean score for the low half and the mean score for the high half. But the variable itself in the analysis we used as a continuous variable. And we've also done, we haven't shown it here or done it in this paper, but we've worked independently on doing some psychometric analyses of the readiness to learn instrument, the scores from the instrument, and it actually does show pretty good properties. We did some reliability analyses and some invariance analyses across gender and educational level and age, and it actually performs pretty well, surprisingly, because initially when we were doing this, we weren't really clear of where it came from, but so when we started talking about it, just operationally defining it in terms of how it's measured, I think it works a little better, and I guess we have a little more confidence in the measure now that we're doing these analyses.
Thank you for the presentations. I'm also addressing the Readiness to Learn group. My question is, first of all, whether there's any correlation or whether you found or checked for a correlation between readiness to learn and participation in non-formal education, because when we did, we found a very small correlation that surprised me. And I wonder, the same, by the way, for readiness to learn and learning at work. And I wondered whether somebody knows if there have been discussions before to separate the scales, to make sure that they have different constructs, different theoretical frameworks behind readiness to learn and learning at work, in order to make sure that they do not interfere too much. Because otherwise I would have supposed that learning at work and readiness to learn should correlate a bit more than when with very small effect sizes and sometimes negatively. And there's another pattern on readiness to learn, because this is a self-reported question. And when we searched for international comparison on readiness to learn, we found patterns. The Asian and the post-Soviet and the Southern European and the West and the rest behave differently, and the Scandinavian. And I would not interpret that as, let's say, the Germans being less ready to learn than the US people, but maybe as kind of a social desirability issue.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the first question, I think, was looking at whether readiness to learn predicts participation in adult education training. And we actually have done some analysis as a separate paper, just preliminary analysis looking at that. And I think we're planning on presenting at the American Educational Research Association for that. And I think our preliminary findings, I've just pulled up the paper here because I can't remember, but I believe, readiness to learn significantly predicted formal participation in formal adult education practices, but not informal. Non-formal, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. And I think you had another question about readiness to learn in terms of predicting learning at work. You have to look back again here and see. I think, readiness to learn did predict, all three skills, both at home and at work. And in terms of the use of the skills at home and at work, it did significantly predict all of them. But it was again much stronger for at home. And I'm sorry, the other questions?
It was just a comment.
Oh, okay.
It was just a comment on readiness to learn being a self-reported skill, which could lead to cultural patterns when you compare Asian countries with Western countries.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of words about that. We really struggled with what readiness to learn was. We went into this thinking that we were looking at learning strategies, because that was really what it was called in certain parts of the the document. But then in other parts, it became clear that their items were not really just related to learning strategies. And when we wrote to the people who wrote the background questionnaire, and when we wrote to OECD, both of them, in different ways, said, well, we never really developed what readiness to learn was. So we really feel that we're starting here and we're kind of organically developing what this idea is, and that's why we fell back on defining it operationally for the moment. And is it culturally based? That's really interesting. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all. We'll have to talk to you later about what you're finding.
I was just going to say we're
Go ahead.
surprised and delighted to find that there may be others who are interested in this construct, and we would be happy to talk to you afterwards.
We're thrilled.
Hi. Thank you again for the papers. I especially appreciated Margaret's report, where it reminded me of the various national workplace literacy projects of a different era. Ron, how much was it that was invested in workplace literacy? Do you recall? It was a multi-year effort, and some of the lessons from that body of programs also gets picked up here. Thank you. But I also, it's with that? 300 plus projects and 200 million. Yeah, so thank you, Jim. So Jim was in the middle of all that too. Right. My question, and sort of picking up on Don's references to the changed work environment, both in terms of a global economy, the changes in work systems and manufacturing, it seems to me the real challenge here, as many have mentioned, is so how do we find more resources to invest in low-income or low-wage workers? So one of the questions I think wasn't answered in the workplace literacy projects was, how do we increase employer investment? Because many of the employers that participated in that didn't do it because of the federal grant. They did it because it matched changes in the overall work systems. And so the federal money actually was if I recall this right, was not really an incentive. It was reinforcing what they had already decided to do. And it seems to me, Don, I love your approach, your suggestion that we all should go see an auto plant to see how manufacturing has changed. But I think one of the things that's also going along with our dilemma around income inequality is that even in manufacturing, it's not just the work systems that have changed, but we now have temp agencies that are staffing these manufacturing companies, which then changes the way of who the employer is and who's going to invest in low-income, low-wage workers. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. If we all agree that we need more resources for a population that is increasingly contingent in many workplaces, and it's now being the responsibility, both in terms of time and money, is being placed on the individual.
Can I just respond to what he just said?
Oh, yeah?
Okay. Not to respond, I agree with you totally. And one of the things we allude to in our paper, although we didn't really talk about it here, is the fact that a lot of the training that companies now pay for in business and industry are for the higher level workers. And so, and one, I think, a really interesting trend is that a lot of these companies are moving more towards self-directed learning for training. And so they're not putting a whole lot of money even at the higher end, but only the higher end can take advantage of the self-directed learning possibilities. So I think it's getting even more dire than you were saying. Yeah.
Okay, last question.
Hi. This question may be too broad, but a lot of things that are coming up are really turning into living skills, if you will. Tony and I and some others here work with a lot of specialized populations such as seniors, older Americans, limited English proficiency, that kind of thing. So with more and more emphasis on broadband adoption, getting online, all having health records, having access to care and services through mHealth, being able, aging in place is a big thing right now that people are looking at carefully. So if you're not working, or you're either because of your age or you have a disability, all these different things, how are you going to keep up with this stuff? How are you going to do your online banking? How are you going to Skype your grandkids? How are you going to access care and benefits? And so much pressure about go online, go online, go online. And then you buy a system and you learn it and it's obsolete in a year. And, you know, so maybe that's a little too broad, but this is the question I was trying to answer at the morning break, and I guess I'm still wondering about a lot of it. So if anyone has thoughts, I'd appreciate it.
Can I take us?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great comment. One of the details I didn't have time to go into was that for the healthcare outcome, though this is a self-reported with all the issues of that, it is a general question that's been used in many federal surveys in this country. The strongest impact of digital literacy, and this is ICT use, not problem-solving proficiency, is in health status, excuse me. And the interesting thing is the effect is much stronger than the comparable effects looking at literacy or numeracy use in the same model. So this is really about ICT use being linked to healthcare, and it is true in seniors particularly. So that I think that, you know, with all of the economic limitations and constraints that Tony mentioned, I think we have outside of work opportunities for getting investments in the development of digital literacy to support better healthcare outcomes.
Steve, was digital literacy was linked to health status?
Health status, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, one thing this has shown is there's lots more work to do with the PIAAC data, and with that, we'll turn it over to the table conversations.